Welcome to the Cypher Podcast, where we discuss all things sci and the paranormal through the lens of remote viewing. I'm Brett Stewart, accompanied by my co-hosts, Emily and David. And in today's show, we're taking an in-depth look at hidden secrets in the Grand Canyon. It's one you're not going to want to miss. But before we get into the discussion today, head over to our website at cypher.com. That's PSIPHR.com. You can listen to our entire back catalog of free shows there. Additionally, we continue these podcasts in our premium after hours episodes, which follow each show. Our subscribers help us keep the lights on, and it also provides a space where we can discuss some of the more controversial aspects of these topics that we investigate. We also regularly give away some of our premium content, which you can access on our website simply by signing up for a free account. And so with that, today's show is on the Grand Canyon. We did some remote viewing data. We found some rather peculiar sights at this location. Emily, you set this one up for us. What is it that we are looking at today?
Thanks, Brett. Yeah, the task for this week was to look at the most significant archaeological site in the Grand Canyon, USA. So there's lots of lore about the Grand Canyon in terms of what is buried beneath the mesa there. And I thought, let's look at what is the most significant archaeological site there and see what we can dig up. Before we get into the discussion, I do want to add a caveat that the data we found, we think is associated with the most significant archaeological site. It's definitely not to say this is the only archaeological site. So there may be places where it doesn't seem like it matches up with perhaps what other people say or what you might believe or even what other historical records report. There's potentially multiple interpretations of this. One is that the data that is in the historical record isn't 100% accurate. Obviously, as always, our RV data might not be 100% accurate, but then there's always the third option, which is that both are accurate. We're just talking about different things. Just something to keep in the back of your mind as we go through the discussion today.
Yeah, Emily, you sent us to, I believe the wording was the most significant archaeological site. And when it comes to the remote viewing perspective, who determines what that is? It's a decision that's made at perhaps the unconscious level, or there's some other metric that our minds are using to go to the most significant. But oftentimes what happens when there's a lot of stuff, viewers are attracted to oftentimes the most interesting kind of psychical attractor. And as we get into this information, we're going to talk about that.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say remote viewers go after the shiny stuff, right? It's like, ooh, squirrel. Anything that's exploding or on fire or zooming past, we're like, yeah, show me that.
Well, this was even evidence, just as a slight tangent, of way back in the day when they were discovering and developing remote viewing. Viewers, instead of going to a nice little cabin in the Virginia woods, accidentally went to an underground government top secret facility that was just over the ridge. Because like, oh, well, surely this must be the thing they're supposed to do. So we certainly got a really wild one as far as what's there, what these hidden secrets are, and also what's associated with them in the psychical space.
So I think I'll start us off here with a little bit of lore about this site. Sort of why would anyone even think that there's a hidden archaeological site in the Grand Canyon? Obviously, the native North Americans have been there for a very long time in the Grand Canyon. But that, interestingly enough, is not what I think we're talking about here today. A fellow by the name of G.E. Kincaid is one of the individuals that is commonly cited when it comes to Grand Canyon lore. The whole narrative starts out with an article in the Arizona Gazette, an article that was published on March 12th, 1909, where Kincaid basically announced that he'd had this expedition that he'd done into the Grand Canyon, and he found a bunch of really interesting stuff, and that he's going to go back. And about a month later, on April 5th, 1909, there's another article that reports that now the Smithsonian has taken over managing this project and nothing to see here, move along. So the original article actually talked about him going into a cave or a cave-like structure inside the Grand Canyon, approximately 1,500 feet below the surface. That was his estimate. There was a mile-long tunnel, and inside this tunnel system, he found things that appeared to be Egyptian-looking, Egyptian-style artwork and hieroglyphs. While this is an interesting bit of lore, I think we all come down slightly differently on how credible or accurate this is. I think there's probably some truth to this. However, I don't think our remote viewing data is fully in alignment with the Kincaid story, and there might be some elements of misinformation or misdirection associated with the story.
There's also this amazing story about the ant people who are said to live deep underground, and they've emerged from the caves through this kiva to help the Hopi people in the past, and they've helped them with things like farming and avoiding famine and like teaching them to germinate beans to avoid starving over winter and stuff like that. They've been a really helpful influence throughout the mythology. When we're getting into all this stuff about lost peoples living in caves, it just makes you wonder, is there an oral history that's going to maybe overlap with this? So once we get into the remote viewing data, I think we'll find maybe the Hopis ant people are not quite the same people that we run into when we start investigating this site, because the ant people seem to be really cool and helpful, whereas what we find is sometimes a little bit more sinister.
In addition to that, I think there's some other interesting data points to bring up as it relates to what we know about the Grand Canyon in modern times. So the first interesting thing to note is many of the land formations there are named after East Asian and Egyptian spiritual and cultural traditions, or things that are significant to those historical cultures. And the naming occurred actually approximately 20 years prior to the whole Kincaid story. It's just a very interesting timeline. David, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, the timeline makes it look a little bit suspicious potentially, doesn't it? But maybe we'll come back to that after we've looked at our data. The naming, especially given the Egyptian connection that comes up in both Brett's data and my own and in the Kincaid story, it's really strange to see these buttes called like the Temple of Ra, and there's loads of Egyptian gods. But then there's also a whole bunch of names from Hinduism, and there's even like the Temple of Wotan or something, which I think is Germanic. So it's, at the face of it, it's just 19th century cultural appropriation of just grabbing whatever sounded cool. But you got to ask, why? It's really strange, this choice. I looked into this to see like who came up with these names, and there's this story about this, I think he's a geologist or something on an expedition there called Dutton, and he believed that the canyon was such an impressive, amazing thing that the names of its features should reflect all of the world's cultures. And we looked at this and we were like, how does that follow? This thing is amazing, so I know we need to take names from all around the world and stick them on it. It doesn't quite add up, but we haven't got to the bottom of that mystery, but it's yet another bit of the history of the Grand Canyon, which seems to slightly smell.
So I think another interesting thing that has spawned quite a bit of speculation about the Grand Canyon to investigators is the fact that there's a lot of areas around these buttes, which for those that don't know what a butte is they are cliffs that are isolated. So they go really high up into the sky, these massive cliffs, but they're not connected to any other. So they're kind of like a free floating island, this massive cliff that juts up into the sky. And there's a lot of these all over the Grand Canyon in between the ravine. The Grand Canyon is not just simply one cliff on one side and one cliff on the other all the way down. It's not so simple. It's actually a myriad of different islands of cliffs and beyond. But there are many aspects of the land here that the government has created no-go zones where it's very, very restricted. First of all, to go down the river, to actually get a license for something like that in certain parts, it can take upwards of 3 years just to get a license to go down the river, which is also kind of strange. But they don't allow a lot of things that they allow in all these other places in the Grand Canyon. They don't allow drones. I think they use the excuse of bats or something like that. But what about all the other bats around the other parts of the Grand Canyon? Apparently they don't matter. Only the bats in this one specific area where there's potentially caves and some hidden mysteries. Oh, no drones here. You also can't fly there as well. They have a specific point in the sky that they don't allow helicopters to go below or planes. And as well as kind of climbing down the cliff. Like there are certain areas that if you go to these places, you will be arrested on site and they disallow people from going into them. To me, when I looked at these no-go zones and these off-limit zones, they just didn't make any sense to me. They seemed kind of random. There wasn't a reason to put this no-go zone here versus a no-go zone 10 miles down the Colorado River in a different part of the Grand Canyon.
I think with respect to the random, Brett, you mean random relative to the explanation that this is an environmental safety thing. It's like, why do we value the environment in this one spot only and not in the other spots? That's inconsistent. But there may be additional reasons why these are there. And I think we'll get into that with our data.
Yeah, it's like they were looking for an excuse that someone who wasn't going to look really further than surface level into it would accept. But if you actually take a hard look into it, it's completely illogical. And all of these restrictions, I'm pretty sure, came after the story of Kincaid. It came after the Smithsonian went into this part of the Grand Canyon and did seemingly an excavation. One other interesting thing that I discovered just in my own research around the Grand Canyon is that there's a tremendous amount of structures that supposedly the Smithsonian put in place. These are large concrete blocks that would be different platforms where you would be able to lower and lift a lot of heavy equipment to. But there's no explanation or any historical signs or any really information about what these were, who put them there, and why. And so it's just a mystery. People find these all over this area, right in this no-go zone. So our imagination goes to wonder, well, what's really going on here? And some of the other stories that I've looked into of other investigators where there used to be holes that you could climb up a cliff like they were originally there, put there by Native Americans. They were filled in with concrete, so you actually can't climb the cliffs. And this was, according to some of the stories, it was done by the U.S. Army of Engineers. So they went in and made it less accessible than it was already. Even there's another instance I found where an entire hole was filled with concrete, which would have led into a cave. And so there's just a lot of high strangeness with no explanation, which I think lends to this mystery about what really went on here.
I think the big question is, if you were using those enormous iron staples in the ground that can clearly support a huge amount of weight being lowered down the cliff, wouldn't that upset the bats? Won't somebody think of the bats?
Those bats had a good lobbyist in that one area. When we get into our remote viewing data, which I think we're going to jump into here in a minute, there's a couple of different layers to this, because in this main show, I think what we're going to cover is the primary narrative of what we found. And it surprised me. Obviously, I did this work. I had no idea where I was being sent to or what I was being tasked. But a lot of my work actually comes from the perspective of a native, I perceive this as a Hopi shaman tribe. And we're going to look into that data. But then for after hours, where I think we're going to spend a little bit more time on some of the more woo factor, because we actually bumped into some rather strange occurrences at this site that, well, it kind of took us in a very different direction, a very woo direction. So I think we should go into some of the RV data here. It's just a pretty small point, but it did come out in my very first session. I got the idea that the information surrounding the tasking that Emily set up for us, that there's truth to it, but that the public narrative is false. That there's been a conjuring of misinformation that's been interwoven with the real story that exists here. And so it would be kind of difficult to parse where the truth is and where the misinformation is. And obviously we have remote viewing at our disposal, so we can go straight to the source. But I definitely picked up on this idea that there's a lot of half-truths or kind of slight lies that are associated with it that would obfuscate what really went on here.
And we've seen this pattern before in so many other sites we've looked at. And I'm sure if you're at all interested in researching esoteric topics, you're familiar with this whole concept of burying truth in amongst a bunch of falsehoods. So what you do is you take something that's true, that just to deny it outright is going to be really challenging because it's certainly going to come out. But then it's mixed in with things that are sort of half-truths and incorrect, and then it's all branded under one umbrella. And I think this is done for the purposes of straw manning. So what that is basically this one bit of the story is absolutely ridiculous and it's wrong, and therefore you can dismiss the entire story. So it's basically set up such that you can't discern what's true and what's false because it's all mixed in together, even though there is some truth to the publicly available narrative.
So it seems like Kincaid or others have discovered some things which would be really challenging to the conventional historical narrative and could be politically sensitive or just really dangerous. And we find some stuff which we'll cover later that genuinely does seem to be dangerous, where there would be a good reason for covering it up and keeping people out of the area. But we also find some stuff that just disagrees with history. And I think it would be so disruptive to acknowledge, especially the discovery of ancient Egyptian culture, which showed up in Brett's session and in my session. And it's in the Kincaid document as well, right? You can't have ancient Egyptians in North America. That breaks the narrative. It ruins everything. There's a lot riding on history being treated as a fact. A lot of people have skin in the game, and it could be very disruptive, right? So there's a clear motive for covering it up. One idea that we had while we were looking over the Kincaid thing and our data is thinking perhaps the timeline of Kincaid is a little bit wrong, in that these articles were released potentially as a mixing of disinformation with truth, as Emily just described, but they may have been released quite some time after the work had already been completed. That's because the naming of the places with all the Egyptian and Hindu and other names happens like 25 years before Kincaid. So it just made us wonder, maybe this had already disappeared into a secret basement somewhere, and Kincaid was put out much later as a smokescreen.
Yeah, it is an interesting coincidence, and it may just be that it's a coincidence. And the fact that there's this big story with Kincaid about finding Egyptian artifacts. But here's the clincher. I saw a bunch of Egyptian stuff as well.
So I think this is a good place to introduce some of our remote viewing data. One of the most interesting pieces of data that we got came out of Brett's session, where, Brett, you actually interacted with what seems like a Native American tribal elder or shaman in sort of a discarnate or a not incarnated spirit form. And it almost seemed like a bit of an interview process that you had. Do you want to start us off with that and share that with our audience?
Yeah, this was really unexpected, but the way this session began is I perceived myself standing just inside a cave. And so it was sunny outside. I was inside a rock facing, it was red rock. And there was a fire pit in there with a tent. And it looked very tribalistic, very Native American looking. And there was a woman waiting outside the tribe saying, hold on, please take a seat. I'm going to go and find someone for you to talk to. And the person that walked out of the tent was an older man, looked Native American, dark red skin, had clothing on that looked like a deer hide. He had a necklace that had different precious stones and rocks on it. This individual, I believe, was just a spirit, something that happened to be associated with the site in the Grand Canyon. But he was very good-natured, and he pulled out a wooden pipe and started smoking and offered me if I wanted something. And I said, I appreciate it, but I'm just an astral traveler here, and I'm very interested in what's going on with the site that Emily has set up for us. And I gave him basically an image of the things that I had seen already up to that point, because this wasn't my very first session. I already done some work on this. But as soon as I pointed him to this location at the site, which is this most significant archaeological place, he began by giving me a little bit of a backstory about what happened. And he gave me these visual pictures of being out on these open plains, and it looked very much in the southwest of America. And he showed me different clans, warriors of different clans fighting on horseback with arrows and shooting and fighting and killing each other. So it was very basic warfare, but very brutal warfare. And as he was showing me these pictures, something happened in the distance in the sky, and it was a very large crack of lightning that shattered the sky and went down into a cliff facing off in the distance. And this happened right in between one of these very large battles that was going on at the time. And he described that all of the warriors of these native tribes stopped fighting to look at what was going on, because this wasn't just an ordinary lightning crack. If it was, they probably would have ignored it. This one was different. This one, when the lightning hit the cliff, the lightning beam stayed. So it's like a circuit was connected. When I saw this visually in the session, it's like a circuit was connected, and this line of electricity from the cliff facing up into the sky stayed put after it cracked down into the cliff face. And all the fighting, all the warriors stopped what they were doing, and they all looked off in the distance, and they figured this must be a sign from the gods that they should stop. But it didn't end there. They actually were so curious, they needed to go figure out where this was happening and why it was happening. And so the way this kind of began from his perspective is that this ended the warfare for the time being because something new showed up on the scene. I think we're going to get into what that is in just a moment.
Yeah, I spoke to these guys too. Not the same elder as you did. I was talking to just a normal person and looking at the effects of all of the events that we're about to describe. Like, how did it affect people's day-to-day life? And I got these tribal groups, but they seem to have banded together at this point. Like, I presume the ones who had been warring are now, they're all together in a loose band. And I said they have a common goal or enemy, right? They've been kind of forced together out of necessity, and they're looking for new land. And critically, they're looking for safety and room to expand. So it really had a profound effect.
Yeah, that actually ended up coming at the end of the story that I got from this disincarnate being that appeared to me as like a native elder, where there was the end result of what happened at the end of that story is they had to leave. And there was a lot of sadness in his voice when he talked about this, where there was like regret and just disappointment in himself at not being able to overcome what came to his lands.
I don't know if this is related to what happened, but in the most recent historical record, we actually have the U.S. government coming in and moving these people, and we can't have you anywhere near this. And they set up all these reservations around the area, but there's even relocations in modern times.
Native Americans have certainly gotten a bit of a raw deal from history, it seems, in these lands. So, well, the story continued from this elder, and he described that the warring parties and the different tribes, they wanted to go investigate what was going on with this kind of permanent fixture of lightning that had struck the cliff and continued to exist in the sky. And visually, when I was seeing this, you could see it from a very far distance away. And so it was interesting and peculiar, and people of these tribes wanted to figure out what was going on. And where this led them to was the side of a cliff face that went really high up, is how I perceived it in the ERV session. And there was an opening at the top of the cliff. So it was a sheer up several hundred feet, possibly several thousand feet. Actually, it was really sheer. And then near the top of this cliff face, there was an opening. There was a hole in the side of the cliff face. And these tribesmen climbed the cliff somehow. I mean, they must be pretty adept at that. I guess they would be in that era. And they looked inside. And what the elder described that what they perceived was something almost out of the movie Stargate. And because what they perceived was an enormous sphere of bright white light where the lightning was coming down from the sky. And it looked like it was powering this spherical opening in space inside the cave. And from this sphere of white light, people were walking out of it into the space. So this was a decent sized cave. This wasn't exactly a super tiny cave. It was decent sized. And there were people walking out of it like they were walking through a teleporter, and they were carrying stuff with them and putting it on the ground. And the thing that stuck out to me the most was these people were carrying coffins that looked like an Egyptian sarcophagi. So the things that the pharaohs would be buried in. It was very detailed. It was very ornate. It was painted gold, had handles on it. And there were these people that were carrying these coffins out of this portal, or Stargate, for lack of a better word. I have reasons to believe it might be a Stargate, but I'll save that for after hours. But they brought this coffin into the cave, set it down. It seemed like they were doing like setting up a base camp inside this thing, and then they left. So what the tribesmen found when they looked into the cave is they saw something like a scene out of a Stargate SG-1 show where a portal opens and humans, strange humans, are walking through this portal and carrying things with them. When this wasn't the first time this happens, but so I'm not sure exactly how these events lined up. In a way, I think I'm kind of being retold this story as like a best effort by the shaman elder, giving me these pictures of what he believes happened and what he was told. But what they saw is that there were these strange foreign people carrying a coffin that looks like a sarcophagus out through a portal. And they brought it out, set it down into the cave, and then ended up going back through this portal. And I wasn't quite sure how long it was open, but it ended up closing after a period of time. And then the lightning strike that was stationary in the sky also receded. So it was very strange. They didn't understand why or how this would have occurred, but it seemed like a whole bunch of foreign individuals brought this coffin through, set it down, and then left.
Brett, as you're telling this story, I'm picturing very much like the movie Stargate, the visual imagery and stuff. It's very reminiscent of that. I wonder if that was a download as well, inspired by true events. Who knows?
Very well could have been inspired by. There wasn't a big ring that was in the space. The portal itself looked to me more like a spherical ball of white light that had kind of crackling energy around it. Interestingly, when the thing was actually made, the portal opened, it actually created a crack or a crevice in the ground. People were coming through, foreign people were coming through it. They were carrying things with them. One of them looked like a sarcophagus, and then they left. And there was a period of just nothing happening. So what the elders said happened next is there was a period of kind of quiet or silence from this area after the stuff had been dropped off for the first time. But that at a point later, the lightning strike reappeared and the portal itself reappeared in the cave. Except this time, it wasn't just a few people carrying some supplies in and then leaving. This time, what the elder described is an armada of foreign invaders started pouring through this Stargate. And these individuals, they weren't from around this part of the planet. He described that they would come from the other side of Earth, and some really peculiar individuals and what they brought with them came through as well. But the purpose of this, what they began doing, is that a bunch of slaves apparently came through with them. And these were workers. These were workers that had one purpose, and that was to begin tunneling out a large underground facility from this cave. This is kind of like their drop point down into the grok. And so what I perceived them doing was creating this series of steps and large tunnel system underneath that went down into a tomb. I'm going to talk about this in After Hours a bit more, but this exact location, we ran into some pretty significant psychic protection and has a whole story behind that in just my interaction with it as a remote viewer that I'm going to talk about in the follow-on After Hours show. But what I found at the bottom of those steps was a tomb, and they brought a whole bunch more caskets with them. And these caskets contained bodies, and there, if you were to go there today, what you would actually find is the portal actually isn't there. You could find the crevice that the Stargate created in the ground when it was opened. You would see the steps down. It's like 45-degree angle of steps going down into the rock face away from where the opening was. And then there was a large area, like rectangular room, and there were coffins on either side of the room filled with bodies that still to this day seem to have their bones intact in these coffins. And everything about it looked Egyptian to me. And this is where the first introduction for me in the remote viewing work that I was dealing with something from Egypt, because it looked straight out of King Tut's tomb. And there was even a mural on the back wall of what looked to me like an Egyptian pharaoh pulling a baby out of I described it looks like he's pulling an infant or a toddler out of the Nile River. So it looks like artwork and hieroglyphs and ancient Egyptian bodies seem to be buried here.
So there was something else that I think was super unique or unusual about these bodies that showed up, Brett, in your session and in David's session as well. Brett, do you want to just go over that really quickly?
So the bodies, when I perceived them from the astral state, I got that there was something wrong with them. First, I thought, oh, wait, there's something strange with these. Are they sick? There's something off about these bones. And when I looked more closely at them, I looked at the skull. And the skull itself was large. It was very, very elongated and did not look human to me. And so it just clicked immediately in the session. I'm like, oh, these aren't humans. This is not your typical Homo sapien sapien that's just been buried in a tomb here like a regular human pharaoh might be. There's something very unique and novel about who these life forms were, what their history was, and it's represented in their skull. The skull itself was very different than a human skull. I don't know if this means that they were some sort of a hybrid human or just a pure extraterrestrial. I'm not sure, but it was not life as we know it.
Elongated skulls are a phenomena which seems to crop up all over the world, like it independently appears. I think people know how soft a baby's head is when it's born because the head has to deform to fit through the birth canal, so babies' heads are really squishy. There's a great deal of evidence of the use of boards and ropes and other tools to create a pointed skull or a flattened skull on the sides. And I think they're quite obvious when you look at them. You can see that they've been created in this artificial way by constraining the growth of the skull. So there have been some cases, though, where elongated skulls have been found and people have said, wait, this is not necessarily the result of head binding. This looks like it's a natural feature of this being. I think, Brett, you've worked on one of those with the teeny-weeny Peruvian mummy with the big head, and there have been claims about this in ancient Egypt as well. Now, it's easy to write these off because there's so much archaeological and historical evidence of it being head binding. So were there to be an authentic case, the mainstream would turn around and quite reasonably say, come on, it's just head binding. Why does it have to be aliens, right? And in researching this, I found a really interesting connection because the character Akhenaten, the pharaoh of Egypt in the 18th dynasty, who's also known as Amenhotep IV, his daughter is really famously depicted as having this elongated head shape, and it looks very round and elegant and naturalistic. And you think, well, if that's not a real example of a extended cranium that wasn't artificially induced, I don't know what would be a better depiction. However, the examples of this in Egyptian art are quite limited. There's not very many of these images of the people with the big heads. So I went looking into this and I discovered some interesting facts about Akhenaten and the pointy heads. So Akhenaten is famous because he tried to convert Egypt to monotheism. He took gods Ra and Hathor, mashed them up together, and that was then morphed into the sun god Aten. And he wanted everybody to worship Aten. He built this city, Amarna, quite quickly, which was supposed to be a seat of the new sun god to be worshipped. And in that same period, we've got depictions of women at a banquet wearing these strange pointy hats. And you could say, well, they have big heads because they're aliens. But in the depiction, you can see that they're hats. They're not the same width as the skull. But they're very curious looking objects that they're wearing here. And not so long ago, one of these cone head objects, head cones, I think they call them, was actually discovered in a burial and found to be made out of wax. So this was a real stylistic thing, like a fashion thing or a beauty thing, or perhaps it's a religious thing. We don't know the reason that people were wearing this. But you could hypothesize, right? If there was a dynasty who may have naturally had this head shape, who are trying to convert people to monotheism, which is a real power grab of a move, right? Because you then associate your single deity with the state authority and you end up with the British monarchy. So it's a hell of a power grab to get rid of the polytheism and install monotheism. And actually, it was rejected. The pharaohs who came after Akhenaten bowed to public pressure and reverted to polytheism. And interestingly, the images of him and his family, many of the statues have been smashed up and the artwork destroyed. He basically got cancelled.
So when I saw the skulls down in the tomb, there was a mural kind of depicting them as this was a pharaoh's family. And I think there was about 12 to maybe 15 different skeletons in this particular tomb. And all of them had this very strange elongated skull head shape. And the words that came through in the session is that these were outcasts. Something seemed different or wrong with them. Their skulls are a different shape, a different structure. They're enormous in size. It's like giant skulls. This is their final resting place. It's the whole family. But the odd thing about this is that it wasn't like, oh, it's just a bunch of adults passing of natural causes and then they just decided to bury them here. This was not that case. This was taking someone who we investigated, which again, we'll go into this in After Hours, but someone eliminated this entire bloodline and eliminated this entire family. Is that there were children's bodies here as well as adult bodies here. And they, for very good reasons, thought that they needed to get these skeletons away from Egypt and bury them as far away as possible, which, well, I guess the Grand Canyon must have seemed like a good place, I suppose, for that. But this was, to me, more of an elimination of a ruling family, of a pharaoh's, and your description of, oh, there was this one dynasty they did something that was not popular, and then the next ones, they smashed their statues and they were canceled from history, lines up very closely with the remote viewing data that I perceived regarding these individuals, these almost hybrid humans that are buried in the Grand Canyon.
When I was piecing together your session data, when I got this sense that to get these bodies as far away from Egypt as possible, the first question that jumped into my mind was why? Why would this be a necessity? This seems like a lot of trouble to go through, right? I'm not a Stargate engineer. I don't know how difficult it is to create these things, but it does seem like to go across the world, open a Stargate, set up another temple to bury stuff. There's lots of temples in Egypt. Why would they go through all this trouble? And I have a feeling, Brett, you have some data and a theory to back that up. And David, I'm sure you do as well. So Brett, why don't you start us off with the big why? Why were they moving away from Egypt in such a big hurry?
Yeah, so what I perceived when I was down in the tomb is that there was something not just strange or off about the skeletons, but there was something associated with them. And the shaman that I spoke with to also reference this is that there's something energetically wrong with the bones themselves. And the shaman referred to them as being cursed. And at the moment they brought those bodies in the sarcophagi to this tomb through the Stargate, the land began to change, that there was like a plague that was wrought upon the land of, this is the area of the Hopi tribe, of the Navajo tribe. I'm sure there are other ones as well. And that the shaman described that it's like toxic acid rain began to fall, that their crops began to die, that the animals fled the area, that this was really, really bad news. He pointed to the sky when describing it and showed these really horrible looking storm clouds of just doom, and the apocalypse is coming for their people. And it was because of what was being brought through the portal were in these coffins.
So this effect like sticks to their bodies somehow, does it? Is this like the hitchhiker effect we see at Skinwalker Ranch, but turned up to 11?
Possibly. I got the perception, I use the analogy of it's like these bones are radioactive. It's like the decay of these bodies is so toxic that the environment that they're in, it's going to pollute it to a point to where the surrounding area is dead. And so you can't keep that in Egypt. You need to remove that. So let's get this as far away from our homeland as possible. And that was the Grand Canyon.
Yeah, I'm really reminded of the biblical story or the biblical narrative of the 10 plagues of Egypt. When you describe this, I can't help but make that connection.
Well, it's a connection for a very good reason, because as I mentioned earlier, one of the murals on the wall that I perceived was a pharaoh reaching down into the Nile. And to be more specific, what's in that mural is he was reaching down to grab a baby out of a reed basket in the reeds on the Nile. And there's a very specific biblical story that's associated with that idea, which is the story of Moses. And Moses, he brought 10 plagues to Egypt to force the Pharaoh's hand to let his people go. And these were locusts and disease, and like the Nile turned to blood. It was absolutely horrible. And so these plagues kind of like were curses. So it makes me wonder, is this the same pharaoh or perhaps a lineage from there that a curse perhaps followed them, and this was kind of the end of the line for that lineage?
So I thought it was super interesting that you had the time of Moses in your session, Brett. I thought, when actually is that? Does this line up with Amenhotep IV or the 18th dynasty at all? So I went to find out just when was the time of Moses, and there's two estimates, both of which are based on kind of biblical calculations because there aren't historical sources. And the earlier of those is the 15th century BC, and then the later is during the rule of Ramses II, which is in the 13th century BC. And so it's a wide range, right? It's a few thousand years that it could be within. But really interestingly and tantalizingly, right bang in the middle between these two date ranges is the reign of Pharaoh Akhenaten, with the elongated headed daughter depiction, the cancelling, the monotheism, sun worship, and all this weird stuff that went down pretty much bang in the middle of the range we have for the time of Moses. So I thought that was a cool little correlation at the very least.
So it could line up. That's the interesting part, is that this pharaoh with the elongated skull could very well, based on the best knowledge we have, occurred during the time of Moses, if Moses was a real character. And it was right there, bang on the wall, was this story of the pharaoh pulling the child from the river. And then immediately in the ERV session, I got that, oh my goodness, this is Moses. That's what's being depicted here, or a story like that. And which led to plagues coming into Egypt and upsetting everything and everyone. And part of me felt that those plagues were something like a curse that was placed upon the pharaoh and his whole family, or the dynasty. So it doesn't mean that this is the exact pharaoh that maybe pulled a child from the river and that it's exactly as the Bible says it is, but that it's more of like maybe it rhymes and the true history isn't quite so straightforward. But there was very good reason for getting these bones away from Egypt, and that's like they were toxic. It was like getting rid of uranium, which, another fun little point, apparently there's a ton of uranium in the Grand Canyon. So kind of an interesting coincidence.
Yeah, the Moses thing, it could even be like your subconscious giving you a clue. It's like, if you go look up Moses, that'll give you the date.
Yeah, very well could be something like that. Yeah.
So I think Brett's RV data gives us sort of a perspective almost from the top down, or from sort of the upper echelons of society at that time. David, I'd tasked you to actually go talk to some of the people that were associated with all of this stuff first coming to Earth. And I think that took you down a path of actually having a conversation with, for lack of a better word, the normal people, or more of the common folks that were around at this time, and how they perceived all of these events sort of from their perspective. Can you share that with us, please?
Sure. This is looking at the impact of after these events and these people have come through. How is it affecting the lives of the people who are there? My first visual on this was a group of people who I briefly mentioned earlier. They're like the tribes that are forced together, who may previously have been warring, but now they have to gang together because they have a common enemy or a common goal. And I had them next to what I described as a sunken valley, which is maybe understating the Grand Canyon a little bit. And they're all there watching the animals migrating and maybe feeling a little bit somber about the whole situation because they're about to move out, right? They need to find somewhere else to live. So I tried interviewing somebody who I specifically said, like, not somebody who's having high strangeness experiences, not anybody who's directly interacting with these newcomers, but just if you're trying to live there, how does your life change? And it was quite unsettling and upsetting for this individual. She said, we got new stuff that was unfamiliar, like rapid change. And this interesting phrase, the world is turning faster. It was that kind of sense of there's way more people, there's loads of stuff going on, and it's the kind of quiet routine of the past has been shattered. Then things start getting strange. She says stuff shows up, there's weird things in the sky. I wasn't sure, but I think it was seasonally or on a regular schedule anyway. There are, and I'm going to say UAP, not UFOs, because the way I perceived them was like little holes of darkness in the sky. It was like the sky had been punched through and you can just see the blackness of space behind. But they were moving around like objects. This darkness theme crops up multiple times in my data. It also, interestingly, crops up in the Kincaid narrative, but maybe we'll get onto that again later. She said a pretty chilling thing as well. The phrase was, the gods are among us now, but it wasn't a happy, yay, the gods are among us, everything's fine. It was, the gods are among us, and it turns out that we are not their priority, and nor is our welfare. And the final bit here was that things didn't seem to make sense anymore because there was this mysterious influence. They couldn't see why events were happening. There was no visible reason for the stuff that was going on. So they've gone from like a very well-established way of life where they know what's happening and why and what's going on and when, and everything is kind of clear. And now they're in this new world, and it's very confusing and disorienting, and it seems to suck. I think I would definitely choose to live in the world before these newcomers arrived.
Yeah, I think we're going to get into in After Hours the force that came through, especially in my work, that this was an invading force. This was not a force that was at all interested in the welfare of those who lived on the land to begin with. One, our data is pointing to, it's like they're using it as a burial/toxic dump for things that they don't want around their homeland. But it seems like they also did a lot more. And we're good. Again, After Hours, I'm going to get into some of these individuals, but some really dark figures came through these portals along with all the workers. And the things they did were, I certainly would be terrified if I was one of the natives at that time. And I totally understand why they ultimately, a lot of them left.
Well, I think this is a good place to wrap up our conversation here. And as we've hinted already, you can follow our conversation into After Hours if that's something that interests you. I just wanted to recap a bit here and just talk about what my main takeaways or points were that surprised me the most about this target. Obviously, I had familiarized myself with the lore of the Grand Canyon prior to setting up this tasking, so I had a reasonable idea as to what we might expect, but certainly the portal and all of the things coming through from Egypt was a little bit beyond what I was expecting to find. My other big takeaway from our data was that there's definitely a confirmation of the lore that's out there in terms of there's likely a connection with Egypt and some ancient artifacts associated with Egypt because of, well, that's where everything kind of came through and came from. There's an element that wasn't all that surprising, but it's kind of cool that our blind remote viewing data did confirm some of the lore or accords with some of the lore that's out there in the broader space. I'm curious, Brett and David, what are your main takeaways, or what did you find most fascinating about this particular topic?
Well, my data looks at the humans and the human impact, and I've got interviews with shamans, leaders, everyday people, and people, for want of a better term, getting abducted. So there's a whole range of human experiences from this, and I really enjoyed doing this project because I felt like a anthropologist, but who could travel through time and speak to anybody they want and not need to learn the language. I've had a real cultural tour de force here. It's been a really enjoyable project for me. And while I did get some seriously high strangeness, freaky deaky stuff, it was really cool seeing how that affected the real humans on the ground.
So another interesting thing, though, that really caught me off guard, since we haven't really run into this with any of our other sessions for the Cypher podcast, is I ran into quite a bit of psychic protection from being able to access the site as well. I was actually bounced away from the site several times. And my very first time I landed at that site, I perceived that there was a boogeyman-like figure that was really unhappy with me being there and was going to do everything in their power to make sure I couldn't stay. So I actually had to do a lot of work on the side. And again, it's where we'll start After Hours most likely, is talking about that story. But I feel like this is really not a place I would ever want to go physically. Like, I definitely wouldn't want to walk into that cave. There's some other stuff going on there that is not really that great.
It does sound like all of those protections that the United States government has put into place might be there for good reason. And we're definitely not advising anyone to go there. And we do mean this in all seriousness. Do not try to go explore this stuff for yourself. It's probably not a good idea.
At least not this particular cave. It may be other places are fine, but this one is pretty yikes. Dangerous.
And we don't know which one this one is on a map, so don't go in any of them. It's dangerous, and you might frighten the bats. So you were mentioning about how you really wouldn't want to go there in person, Brett. And there's this interesting quote from Kincaid, and he's saying they found this one chamber inside the underground complex, and when we approached it, a deadly snaky smell struck us, and our lights would not penetrate the gloom. And it sounds like a ghost story. They think it may contain, interestingly, deadly gas or chemicals used by the ancients. The gloom is like a weight on one's shoulders, and our flashlights and candles only make the darkness blacker. So it sounds like maybe they met the same thing that you did, but they met it in the physical world.
Yeah, it could be that this is pure speculation, but perhaps the decay of these bones, since they're not human, actually is a toxic thing to organic matter. This is just speculation. And so I wonder if that is an accurate accounting that they bumped into that particular part of the underground complex.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it does stink, but the account of their flashlights making the darkness blacker, it sounds like they got woo-wooed. It sounds like something psychic was going, don't go in here, it's very scary, and they were like, yeah, let's not go in there, let's go down here.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, something like a djinn exists there, and we'll talk more about that later in After Hours.
Yeah, I didn't meet this thing in the same way that you did because I was not actually in this cave site that you were, but I did get blocked a couple of times when I was interacting with the psychic I'm going to say agency, but I don't mean like 3-letter agency. I mean will or intent, which is a really interesting thing. When I was trying to find out what that was up to, my data just cut off dead. There was just nothing. It was like a rug pull, and I had to just go like, fine, I give up. Let's go talk to some people again and leave this weird stuff alone. So I just want to add one more thing. We're not joking about don't go to the Grand Canyon because you'll get dead and then you'll get arrested. But if people are interested in investigating this more, in some of my final data, I got that the descendants of the people who experienced this are still out there. The oral histories, the stories are still being told, and they may be difficult to understand, but there are clues out there, right? So go to the library to investigate. Don't go abseiling down the Grand Canyon with a drone, please.
Yeah, I would just be careful. I think it's worthy of investigation, but there's dangers there, so be very careful. Well, with that, I think we're going to wrap this up and continue our discussion in After Hours. Thank you, everybody, for joining us on this adventure of the Cypher Podcast into the Grand Canyon. We definitely got a lot of information on this particular topic, and if you want to join us in a discussion, definitely head over to our Twitter account. That's @CypherPodcast, and it's where Emily, David, and myself would be happy to have a conversation with anyone there. So there'll be a show episode post that you can talk to us through. And if you want to get access to the After Hours, head over to our website. That's cypher.com, PSIPHR.com. And sign up for a membership there and get access to our entire back catalog of all of these wonderful and strange paranormal podcast shows. So thank you for joining us, everyone, and we'll see you on the next one. Take care, everybody.